Hello students and hello everyone. This is Teacher Angel and welcome back to our accounting online video lessons. For today, our lesson is all about PFRS 8 operating segments. At the end of this lesson, the students should be able to apply the standards in the accounting for operating segments. Specifically, they should understand the concept of an operating segment, identify the criteria for the recognition of a reportable operating segment, and identify the information required to be disclosed for a reportable operating segment. Now let's go to the lesson proper. So the core principle of PFRS 8 operating segment is that the entity shall disclose information to enable users of its financial statements to evaluate the nature and financial effects of the business activities in which it engages and the economic environments in which it operates. Under PFRS 8, it specifies that an unlisted entity that chooses to apply PFRS 8 shall comply with all of the requirements of PFRS 8. Otherwise, it shall not describe the information as a segment information. And to what type of companies or to what type of reporting does the PFRS 8 apply? So PFRS 8 applies to the separate, individual, and consolidated financial statements of an entity which is publicly listed or in the process of enlisting publicly. So when we say that the entity is publicly listed, it means that the company is selling its shares of stocks in the public shares market, or here in the Philippines, we have the Philippine Stock Exchange. If a financial report contains both the consolidated and separate financial statements of a parent that is within the scope of PFRS 8, the segment information is required only in the consolidated financial statements. So since PFRS 8 talks about operating segments, let us define what is an operating segment. So an operating segment is a component of an entity that engages in business activities from which it may earn revenues and incur expenses, including revenues and expenses relating to transactions with other components of the same entity. When we say a component of an entity, this comprises operations and cash flows that can be clearly distinguished operationally and for financial reporting purposes from the rest of the entity. It can be cash generating unit or a group of cash generating unit. So when we talk about a cash generating unit, it is defined as the smallest identifiable group of assets that generates cash inflows from continuing use that are largely independent of the cash inflows from other assets or group of assets. Simply stated, a cash generating unit is a segment of business that generates revenue and cash inflows independently. In practice, a cash generating unit may be a department, a product line, or a segment of a business. Second, an operating segment is a component of an entity whose operating results are regularly reviewed by the chief operating decision maker to make decisions about resources to be allocated to the segment and assess its performance. So based on this statement, we can define the chief operating decision maker as the one who makes these decisions in terms of the allocation of resources and determining if the segment is earning or performing well, because he is the one who's going to assess the performance. The chief operating decision maker may be the entity's chief executive officer, chief operating officer, or a group of executive directors, depending on who within the organization is responsible for the allocation of resources and assessing the performance of the operating segments. So this chief operating decision maker is not a position in the company, but rather this is a function or a role. That's why the function or the task of being the chief operating decision maker could be given to any of these listed personnels or positions in the company. Then third, the operating segment is a component of an entity for which there is discrete financial information that is available. When we say it is discrete, it means that there is separate financial information that is available. Now, what is a reportable segment? So, based on this PFRS 8, there is a requirement here that there should be a reporting of an operating segment. Okay, but what segments shall we report? So, accordingly, under PFRS 8, an entity shall report separately information about each operating segment that, number one, management uses in making decisions about operating matters or those which results from aggregating two or more of those segments, and second, qualify under the quantitative thresholds. So the segments in the company that should be reported separately, because other segments can also be reported but not on a separate reporting. So there are segments nga ma-highlight or will be presented separately from other segments. So the criteria to determine if that segments, that particular department, that particular section of the company will be reportable or will be reported separately in the FS based on the following. So again, first, if management uses in making decisions about operating matters or those which results from aggregating two or more of those segments, and second, if those segments will qualify under the quantitative thresholds. Okay. So first, we go to the first requirement so that a segment or an operating segment will be reportable. So again, number one, if management uses the information from the segment. So this is what we refer to as the management approach. So management approach in identifying the reportable segments is being applied, okay, in determining or identifying what segments to be reported. Under the management approach, operating segments are identified on the basis of internal reports that are regularly reviewed by the entity's chief operating decision maker. Again, who is this chief operating decision maker? So he is tasked to allocate the resources to the segments and assess the performance. So if those segments are vital and very important, especially in making decisions per decisions of the chief operating decision maker, then that segment will be included in the reportable segment. So, from where do the management get the information? So that would be on the basis of the internal reports that are being reviewed by the chief operating decision maker. Based also on the number one criteria, so the decisions about operating matters that results from aggregating two or more of those segments. So this is the aggregation criteria. So two or more operating segments may be aggregated or may be combined or added together into a single operating segment if the segments have similar economic characteristics and the segments are similar in each of the following respects. We have nature of the products and services, nature of the production processes, type or class of customer for their products and services, the methods used to distribute their products or provide their services, and nature of the regulatory environment, if applicable, for example, banking, insurance, and public utilities. So in the reports that will be reviewed by by the management, so it could be that the reports are coming from the aggregated or combined segments. And again, the segments may be aggregated or may be combined if they have similar economic characteristics and also similar in terms of the following items. Then the second criteria, so that the operating segment can be reportable. So aside from the management approach, we also have the quantitative thresholds. So when we say it's a threshold measured quantitatively, this means that there is a certain numeric criteria for us to be able to identify if the segment is reportable. And what are those criteria, quantitative criteria? So an entity shall report separately information about an operating segment that meets any of the following quantitative thresholds. So when we say any, it means that anyone. So if it meets the first test or first criterion, then it is a reportable segment. If it meets the second criterion but not the first one, it is still an operating segment that is reportable since it meets the second or the one criterion. Or if it meets the third criterion but not the first and second criterion, still it is a reportable segment because the requirement as a minimum any of the quantitative threshold. If it meets all of the thresholds, then that's reportable. But if less than one or only one among all of those quantitative criterion, still it can be a reportable segment. So let's go to the first criterion. The segment's revenue is at least 10% of the total revenues, external and internal. Okay, so the first quantitative criterion or threshold here, so a segment can be identified as a reportable segment if its segment revenue is at least 10% of the total revenues, both the external and internal. Okay, so this segment revenue, including both sales to external customers and also the inter-segment sales or transfer, so sale to and from between segments, is at least 10%. Okay, the second one is if it does not pass um, on the first quantitative threshold, then we can check the second threshold. So for the second threshold, the segment asset is the basis. So at least 10% of the total assets of the segment, external and internal, including the inter-segment receivables in terms of the internal transaction. So if that segment's asset will meet 10%, at least 10% of the total assets, then it can be a reportable segment. So if it meets the second threshold, then it is a reportable operating segment. But what if it did not pass the first and the second quantitative threshold, or the revenue and assets test? Then we can check the third quantitative threshold. So you can check the segment's profit or loss. Okay, so the segment's profit or loss is at least 10% of the greater in absolute amount of, first, the combined reported profit of all operating segments that did not report a loss, and the combined reported loss of all operating segments that reported a loss. So what does the third criterion mean? So you have to check first the profit and losses of all the segments. So you list down all of the profits and all of the losses for each segment. Then you have to add all the profits of all the segments that earned a profit, or those that did not report a loss. So you combine all segments which earned a profit, and you also combine the losses of all those segments that reported a loss, and then compare the two groups, the group which earned a profit and the group which incurred a loss. So between the two groups, you have to select the greater in absolute amount. So regardless if that is a loss, okay, if it's a loss, that's negative. So obviously, if we're going to compare two numbers, a positive one and a negative one, of course, a positive one would be greater. But in here, we're not looking at the sign, okay, the sign of the number, but on the absolute amount. So meaning, even if it's a loss, just remove the negative or the parenthesis on the loss, and you compare the absolute amount regardless of the sign. Compare the loss with that of the profit, and whichever would be the greater amount, that will be the basis of our 10%. Okay, 10% of the profit or loss. So to illustrate better, okay, let's go to this illustration. So we have segments A to E. The following are the reported revenues, the profit or loss, and the assets. So if we're going to base it on the revenue criterion, okay, so for the revenue criterion, that's at least 10% of the total revenues. So you have to check the revenues of the segments. The total revenue of all the segments is 40 million. If you're going to compute the 10% of the total revenue, so that's 4 million. So if it's 4 million, that's the minimum amount or the minimum threshold. So let's check each of the segment. Is segment A qualify, or does segment A qualify for the at least 10% of the 40 million? So that's 4 million. So the answer would be yes. Okay, segment A qualifies. How about segment B? At least 4 million. So this segment qualifies. How about segment C? Does the segment qualify? So at least 4 million. So that's yes. For segment D, the threshold is at least 4 million. But since 3 million is lesser than the threshold, the minimum threshold, then it did not qualify. And for segment E, since the segment revenue is 2 million, which is lesser than the minimum threshold of 4 million, then it did not qualify as well. So based on the revenue test, segment A, B, and C meets the criterion for the revenue. Therefore, A, B, and C are reportable segments. But D and E should not worry, okay? So we can check the other criterion if the two segments will meet any one of the two remaining criteria. Let's go to these segments assets. So 10%, so that's the second criterion, at least 10% of the total assets. So the total assets here is 45 million. So therefore, the 10% is 4 million 500. So at least 4 million 500. So let's check the first segment. So did it meet the criterion of 4.5 million assets? So that's yes. For segment B, at least 4 million 500. Yes, it also meets the criterion. And for segment C, we have 3 million. Did it meet the criterion? The answer is no, because it's lesser than 4 million 500. How about segment D? The same. It did not meet the minimum threshold. And segment E also, kulang. Kulang pa siya og 500 to meet the criterion. So therefore, it did not meet the asset criterion. Therefore, only A and B meets the quantitative threshold of at least 10% of the segment assets. So if we base it on the asset criterion, then only A and B meets the criterion. But if you're going to ask, how about C, ma'am? So na disqualify na ba si C because it did not meet the asset criterion? The answer is no, because 'di ba, any of the thresholds is needed in order to be qualified as a reportable segment. So if we'll use the revenue criterion, so segment C meets the criterion, then therefore C is still a reportable segment. Now let's go to the profit or loss threshold, or the profit or loss criterion. So at least 10% of the greater amount between the combined profits and also the combined losses. So if we're going to look at the combined profits here, okay, so we add all those segments that earn a profit. So we have segment A, segment B, then segment C. So the total profit of those segments that earned a profit would be, so that's 1,000,007 plus 500, that's 2,200,000 plus 200, so that's 2,400,000. And let's compare that with the absolute amount of the loss. The loss here is from C and from E. So that's 1 million plus 100, so 1,100,000. Let's get the absolute amount, so regardless of the sign. So 1,100,000 versus 2,400,000 profit. So since in absolute amount, the profit has the greater amount, so we will use the 2,400,000 as the basis. So 2,400,000 times 10%. Okay. So let's check if any of the segments meet the profit or loss criterion. So 2,400,000 times 10%. That's 240,000. Okay? So at least 200, sorry, at least 240,000. So let's check one by one. Na-meet ba ni segment A ang 240,000? Okay, the answer is yes. Okay? A lot greater gani. How about segment B? At least 240,000. The answer is yes also. How about segment C? Okay, so even if segment C has a negative income here, so obviously that's a lesser amount. So the absolute amount of 240,000 will be used. So therefore, we also use the absolute amount of segment C. Okay? So the absolute amount of segment C is 1 million. So since 1 million is greater than 240,000, which is the minimum threshold, then therefore segment C is a reportable segment. Segment D, that's 200,000. That's lesser by 40,000 compared to our minimum threshold. And for segment E, if we get the absolute amount, that's 100,000. Also, lesser than our minimum threshold in terms of the profit or loss. So therefore, among all the segments from A to E, we have A. Okay, at least 1 month sa threshold ang ma-meet. We have B, and then we have C. Again, even if only one criterion is met, automatic that is a reportable segment. So it does not necessarily require that all of the thresholds will be met, just one. And if that criterion is met, then automatic that's a reportable segment. So how about D and E? Okay? If we're going to recall, diba? So the overall reportable segments here are A, B, and C. So how do we deal with segment D and E? So again, since segment D and E did not meet any one of the 10% criterion, whether as to revenue, asset, or profit or loss, then they are not reportable segments. But it does not mean that they are irrelevant segments or we ignore those segments. So what we will do is that D and E can be combined for reporting purposes. Unlike segment A, B, and C that they are presented or reported separately, segment D and E may be combined for reporting purposes, but again, A, B, and C shall be reported separately. Thus, they will be disclosed separately in the notes. Then we have here a limit on the external revenue. So the total external revenue reported by reportable segments shall at least be 75% of the entity's external revenue. Okay? So again, if the total external revenue of the reportable segment constitutes less than 75% of the entity's external revenue, additional operating segments shall be identified as reportable segments even if the segments do not meet the 10% quantitative thresholds until at least 75% of the entity's external revenue is included in the reportable segment. Okay, so kani siya. Kung ang total external revenue, okay, the sales and income to outside customers. So if the total external revenue of the reportable segments constitutes only 75%, so less than siya sa entities external revenue. Remember how we're looking at the revenues, external revenues of the operating segment. So if you're going to sum up all of their external revenues and mas gamay siya or mas lesser siya compared to the 75% minimum, okay? 75% of the entity's external revenue, then we need to add additional operating segment to meet the minimum 75% requirement, even if the other segments did not meet the 10% test. Diba? We have the three thresholds. So, even if daw wala na meet yung 10% na criterion ato, kinahanglan or it is needed that we meet this external revenue requirement wherein dapat ang total external revenue of the reportable segments identified would be at least 75% of the entity's external revenue. Now, what are the required disclosures? So, the following will be the disclosures for each reportable operating segment. So, first, we have the general information about the operating segment. So, this includes the factors that are used to identify the reportable segment, whether it is based on the revenue, the profit or loss, or the assets. Okay. So that's what I have explained earlier. Second is the types of products and services from which each reportable segment derives revenue. So nakulangan. Again, type of products and services from which each reportable segment derives revenue. Second would be information about the segment profit or loss. Okay, so the entity shall disclose the segment profit or loss under all circumstances. However, an entity shall disclose segment assets and segment liabilities if such an amount is regularly provided to the chief operating decision maker. So aside from the profit or loss, also the assets and liabilities of the segment. And we have reconciliations of the totals of segment revenue, segment profit or loss, segment assets, and segment liabilities to corresponding items in the entity's financial statements. Okay, so those are the major disclosures needed. Also, we have to disclose on the major customer. So, a major customer here is a single external customer providing revenues of 10% or more of an entity's revenue. So, at least 10% ang na-contribute niya in terms of the revenues earned by the company. So, what will be disclosed about the major customers? The total amount of revenue from all major customers, identity of the segment or segments reporting the revenue. Identity, okay, not entity. The identity of the segment or segments reporting the revenue. Remember, we are identifying the segment, not the major customer. So you have to identify which segments have reported the revenue from that major customer and the fact of reliance from major customers. Again, the entity is not required to disclose the identity of the major customer or the amount of revenue from each segment or amount of revenue that each segment reports from that customer, because what is required in letter A is the total revenue from all major customers. So you have to combine all the revenues of all the major customers. You are not required to specify how much is the earnings from each of the major customer, nor it is required that you have to name who is your major customer, because what is required to be identified here is the segment or the segments that report the revenue from that major customer. And what are the other disclosures related to operating segments? We have entity-wide disclosures apply to all entities subject to PFRS 8, including those entities that have a single reportable segment. Revenues from external customers attributed to the entity's country of domicile, or this is where your permanent home is, and attributed to all foreign countries in total from which the entity derives revenues, and non-current assets other than financial instruments, deferred tax assets, post-employment benefit assets, and rights arising under insurance contracts located in the entity's country of domicile and located in all foreign countries in total in which the entity holds assets. If you like this video, don't forget to click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be updated with the latest video lessons. Thank you for watching.